the view of the state. What do I mean by this? I think that both teams in this house focus more on the competition of these corporations and their inclination to whether or not they will listen, as well as the influence of the government over these businesses. This means to say that both sides of the house literally was talking about how they could change what the businesses essentially do, and that is something that we are not going to do coming from closing government. How we are going to delineate ourselves coming from closing government is we are going to talk about what the movement essentially looks like, what their goals are, and how they want to get to it, right? We think that as a movement, it's essentially a group of people with a singular goal, and their goal is to be able to change status quo. This means that they don't only want to change the corporations, but they want to change the laws that take place, because the laws are essentially the basis of how these corporations manage their work and manage their policies. We think that through changing these things, they want to be able to maximize their resources. This means to say that a social movement has limited resources, such as limited time, limited money, limited people, and that's why they need to be able to work effectively and efficiently at the same time. And because of that, I have an extension for you as to why it is more strategic for an environmentalist group to target the government, because of three things. Number one, government interest. Number two, movement resources. And number three, clashing business ideals. But before I move on to my extension, a few direct responses to the previous theme. One response that I have is that they said that there is a direct lobbying power in terms of being able to lobby with the companies because you're directly talking to them, so there's a direct negotiation. But this is when I say that I have to talk about directness versus scope. We do concede that the contribution or the communication that you have with the companies are more direct than what you have with the state or the government. However, you have a smaller scope. This means to say that if you talk to the government, they're able to encompass multiple laws that essentially target multiple companies, as opposed to just one company in terms of having one set of laws that dictate how that company goes. This means to say that you have a smaller scope and you're sacrificing that scope for the sake of being more direct with the person that you're trying to talk to, and we don't think that that trade-off is essentially worth it. We think that scope is more important simply because we lack time. The environment is always degrading and we don't have the time to go one by one for all of these corporations. My next response has to do with companies being able to care about the environment more, right? The previous speakers talked about how the companies essentially care more about the environment, and we don't think that this is necessarily true, because when they ruin a certain form of environment, they can always jump ship. We think that these companies aren't stuck to a place. They're multinational corporations, and they always can change headquarters, they can change where they receive their goods from, and they can change where they get their imports from. Unlike these states, where these states are literally attached to these lands and cannot change it. And that actually leads me to my first extension today. What do we mean by this? We think that opening talked about how the government has more reach because they can control the companies. What is lacking within their analysis from opening? We think that they assume the benefit accrues. They assume that the benefit of the corporation or of the government rather saying yes exists, while forgetting the fact that you have to convince the government to say yes first. And number two, it also doesn't take into consideration the process of how the strategy of a social movement essentially works. So what are we going to do in closing government? We're going to fill in those gaps. We're going to engage with opposition's arguments as to why it's a good way to be able to target the state instead, as opposed to the companies. Now, this is how this extension is going to go. Number one, I'm going to talk about the government interest. Number two, I'm going to talk about the limited resources of the movement. Number three, I'm going to talk about the flashing ideals. Now, first, let's talk about the state's vested interest in the environment. We think that the missing analysis that they had is they don't know why the government is going to say yes, but we have the answer for you. It's because the environment essentially defines the quality of life these people have and the state of their economy. It defines how well people live. It defines their imports, their exports, their usable land, their strength amidst physical calamities. What does this mean? It means that the state literally has a reason to care about the environment. If the environment is horrible, if the environment is in shambles, so are their people and their economy. So the environmentalist groups have a bargaining chip to be able to play, because it is in the government's best interest to be able to listen, because they literally have the stake if it goes down. So why are the corporations essentially different? The corporations are essentially different because if they negatively harm the environment, they can always import goods, they can always relocate, they can always abandon ship, and they have no stake in the game. That's why they have no reason to care for the state as much as the corporation, about as much as the government does, rather. We think that that's why it's more strategic to target the governments. Now let's talk about the second structural consideration then. the limited resources of the environmental movement. We think that there is a limited number of resources of the environmental movement simply because they have limited social capital. We think that they have barely any supporters. We think they have limited financial capital because only a handful of them are rich. And we think they also have limited time because the environment is constantly degrading the more time they waste, right? We think that they need to be able to focus on these resources, and if they focus on each of these businesses one by one, they would exhaust a lot of time and a lot of money just trying to get one corporation to be able to change, or even the dominant ones to be able to change. And we think that convincing them would be difficult because they're multinational corporations who can skirt the system no matter how they, in any way that they want it, right? We think that if you just target the state, then you literally maximize the potential of your resources, because you don't have to tell your people to go everywhere. You don't have to tell your people to buy bus tickets to be able to go to that company, to go to that site that they're dumping chemical trash on, but rather they just go to one place, they lobby in one location, and they lobby to the same people, and to be able to have that discussion with the same people. And because of that, you're able to maximize the limited resources the companies essentially, or the environmental movements essentially have. Now let's talk about the final structural consideration, the clashing business ideals. This is when government side or opposition side is essentially lacking. We think that they're lacking simply because business needs essentially clash. The needs of a mining corporation might clash with the needs of a clothing corporation, and that is why the things that you will ask from them might go against each other. For instance, they need to be able to transmit less waste, and the other one needs to transmit more waste, and you need to be able to essentially talk to them about these things, and what you are asking from them might clash with one another. And because of that, there will be a lot of infighting among all of these businesses, and you essentially can't allow them to agree on one thing. And because of that, we think there's going to be a lot of miscommunication. In order to avoid this miscommunication, we want to be able to target it to the root cause of the problem, which is already the basis of what they're doing, which is the laws that are created by the state. And if you essentially change the laws by the state, then all of these businesses will essentially have to follow, and they won't have clashing ideals anymore because they have to work within the parameters set by the government. Never been prouder to propose. Thank you.